There are stories that people are killed for, but there are even more dangerous stories, those that cause people to be simply erased from reality. Journalists investigating global corruption schemes are fighters on an invisible front. They uncover the secrets of the most powerful politicians, corporations, and criminal syndicates. And sometimes, instead of threats, they are met with deafening silence. Complete, untraceable, violent disappearance. Where do those who dare to learn too much actually go? We will try to trace their last steps into darkness. In a world where information has become the ultimate weapon and the most valuable resource, there are people who have made it their profession to seek the truth. They are investigative journalists. They don't just write articles or shoot reports. They do painstaking, often invisible work, exposing the festering sores on the body of society, corruption schemes, illegal deals, and abuse of power. Their work is not just a profession, it is a mission that helps to uphold democracy and the rule of law, because it is corruption that undermines their foundations, like Rust 19. When money and power are used to circumvent the law, everyone suffers, from ordinary citizens who do not receive quality public services to entire nations whose development is hampered by theft at the highest levels. Journalists who shed light on these dark deeds become the last bastion against total injustice. But this mission comes at a price, and it is incredibly high. Immersing themselves in a world of dirty money and shady deals, these people risk not only their careers, but also their freedom, health, and often their lives. Imagine a battlefield, but instead of soldiers on the front lines, there are reporters with tape recorders and cameras. And instead of enemy armies, there are powerful politicians, transnational corporations, and criminal syndicates willing to do anything to keep their secrets safe. According to a report by the Center for Foreign Policy entitled "Unsafe to Investigate," the overwhelming majority of investigative journalists, namely 71% of those surveyed in 41 countries, have faced threats and harassment in the course of their work. These are not just numbers. These are real stories of real people. 81% of them received verbal threats. 79% were victims of trolling on social media. And 70% received written threats, 13. This is constant psychological pressure that wears people down and forces them to live in fear. But threats are just the tip of the iceberg. More than half of respondents have faced civil lawsuits, surveillance, interrogations by the authorities, and smear campaigns aimed at destroying their reputation, 13. Investigative journalism has become one of the most dangerous specializations in the media. And when threats don't work, those who want to hide the truth resort to more radical measures: murder, imprisonment on trumped-up charges, and perhaps the most terrifying of all, enforced disappearances. A person simply disappears. No trace, no witnesses, no clues for investigators. They leave home to go to work, to a meeting, answer a phone call, and never return. For their family and colleagues, a hellish period of uncertainty begins that can last for years, even decades. It is this dark world that we will explore, a world where the truth is worth a life, and silence is the key to safety. We will try to understand where and why those who dare to challenge the most powerful forces in the world disappear. When we say a journalist has disappeared, what do we really mean? This is not a case of someone getting lost in the woods or losing their memory. In the world of human rights and international law, there is a clear and frightening term: enforced disappearance. By definition, it is the arrest, detention, abduction, or any other form of deprivation of liberty by agents of the state or by persons acting with the authorization, support, or acquiescence of the state, followed by a refusal to acknowledge the deprivation of liberty, or by concealment of the fate or whereabouts of the disappeared person, which places them outside the protection of the law. It is the perfect crime. No body, no case, no official arrest, no prisoner. A person simply vanishes, erased from reality, leaving behind only a vacuum of uncertainty. International organizations such as the Committee to Protect Journalists, CPJ, and Reporters Without Borders, RSF, have been keeping track of such cases for decades, and their statistics paint a grim picture. According to the CPJ, there are at least 65 cases of missing journalists worldwide. Just think about it. 65 people whose families still do not know whether their loved ones are alive or what has happened to them. Reporters Without Borders provides its own statistics. In the decade since 2015, 19 journalists have been victims of enforced disappearances and are still listed as missing. And if you dig deeper, it turns out that almost half of all journalists missing worldwide are victims of enforced disappearances, which, according to human rights activists, involve state structures. The geography of this phenomenon is vast, but there are regions that have become real black holes for the press. According to the CPJ, almost a third of all missing journalists disappeared while covering armed conflicts in Iraq, Lebanon, Syria, and Yemen. These are places where the law does not apply and human life is worthless. A journalist with a camera is an unwanted witness who can easily be eliminated. But conflicts are only one side of the coin. The other, no less dangerous side, is the fight against organized crime and corruption in seemingly peaceful countries. Mexico ranks first in terms of danger. Since 2005, at least 16 journalists have gone missing in this country. They wrote about drug cartels, about links between officials and criminals, about political violence, and for that, they were wiped out. In Colombia, journalists covering the activities of criminal groups also risk disappearing at any moment. But it is not only criminals who use this method. There are governments that have turned enforced disappearances into a tool of state policy. In countries such as Syria, Eritrea, Libya, Iran, and Turkmenistan, journalists can be held for years in secret prisons without contact with the outside world. Their families receive no information, and the authorities simply deny that they exist in the system. This is an attack not only on specific individuals, but on freedom of speech as a whole. Every such disappearance sends a loud and clear message to all other journalists. There are topics that cannot be touched. There are names that cannot be mentioned. And the price for breaking these unspoken rules is complete oblivion. Mexico, a country of bright colors, ancient civilizations, and mortal danger for those who ask uncomfortable questions. Outside the official war zones, it is perhaps the most dangerous place on the planet for a member of the press. Here, the front line does not run through deserts and mountains, but through city streets, police station corridors, and officials' offices. And the enemy here is not the army of another state, but a pervasive octopus consisting of drug cartels and corrupt officials who have merged into a single deadly organism. Since 2005, At least 16 journalists have disappeared without a trace in Mexico. 16 lives cut short in obscurity. Their stories are not just statistics, but tragedies that expose the full depth of the Mexican crisis. Take, for example, the story of Alfredo Jimenez Mota, a reporter for the newspaper El Imparcial. He was only 25 years old when he disappeared on April 2, 2005, in the city of Hermosillo. Alfredo was a rising star in investigative journalism. He fearlessly wrote about drug trafficking, the war between cartels for control of territory, and, most dangerously, the links between high-ranking officials and leaders of the criminal world, including the notorious Joaquin El Chapo Guzman. On the day of his disappearance, he was supposed to meet with an informant. He left for the meeting and was never seen again. His case became a symbol of the impunity that reigns in the country. Despite all the demands of his colleagues and international organizations, the investigation has never yielded any results. Or the story of Maria Esther Aguilar Cancime, mother of 2 children, reporter for the newspaper El Diario de Zamora and the agency Cambio de Michoacán. She disappeared on November 11, 2009. Maria specialized in crime reporting and covered police activities. Shortly before her disappearance, she published a series of articles suggesting that the new local police chief and his subordinates might be linked to the La Familia Michoacana cartel. She received threats, but continued to work. On the day she disappeared, she went to pick up her children from school, but never made it home. Her car was found abandoned. There were no ransom demands or any news about her fate. Nothing. These cases are not exceptions, but the rule. Journalists in Mexico are kidnapped, tortured, and killed with terrifying regularity. Those who dare to investigate corruption in the army or police, the activities of cartels, or political violence find themselves in the crosshairs. Their work is seen as a direct betrayal of the interests of those who hold real power in the region. Often, local authorities do not simply stand by, but actively obstruct investigations, leading them down false trails or simply losing evidence. The Mexican labyrinth is a place where the truth can cost you your life, and silence is the only way to save it. But even in the face of such a threat, there are brave souls who continue their work, believing that the light of their reporting will one day dispel the darkness that has engulfed their country. If Mexico is a battlefield against an invisible enemy, then the Middle East and Africa are regions where war is not hidden behind a mask of peaceful life. These are territories of total chaos, where states have collapsed and power has fallen into the hands of armed groups, field commanders, and terrorist organizations. Here, a journalist is not just an unwanted witness, but a valuable asset. They can be exchanged, used for propaganda, or simply eliminated to cover up war crimes. According to the Committee to Protect Journalists, almost a third of all journalists missing worldwide have disappeared in such areas, in Syria, Iraq, Libya, and Yemen. Syria has become a veritable black hole for the press. Since the start of the civil war in 2011, dozens of reporters have disappeared there. Some were kidnapped by Bashar al-Assad's forces and disappeared in his notorious prisons. Others fell into the hands of the Islamic State or other jihadist groups. The story of American journalist Austin Tice is a striking example. In August 2012, he, a former Marine captain and at the time a freelancer working for McClatchy and The Washington Post, was kidnapped at a checkpoint near Damascus. Since then, virtually nothing has been known about his fate. Except for a short video, that appeared a few weeks after his abduction. His family and the U.S. government have not given up hope of his return, but over the years, there has been no convincing evidence that he is alive. A similar fate befell Lebanese photojournalist Samir Kassas, who worked for Sky News Arabia. He disappeared in Syria in October 2013, along with his team. They simply stopped communicating. Who kidnapped them and what happened to them remains a mystery, shrouded in the darkness of war. In such conditions, the very concept of investigating a disappearance becomes virtually impossible. There is no legitimate authority to turn to, no police to search for them. There are only warring factions, each of which sees the journalist as a spy or an enemy. But it is not only areas of active combat that are dangerous. The shadow of violent disappearances also hangs over the African continent. In Mozambique, in the province of Cabo Delgado, an armed conflict linked to the activities of Islamist militants and the struggle for natural resources has been smoldering for several years. Arlindo Chisale, a journalist with the radio station Radio Comunitaria de Palma, was one of those who dared to cover these events. He reported on attacks by militants, the suffering of civilians, and perhaps other things that some people did not want to make public. In November 2021, he was abducted by unknown armed men in military uniform. Since then, there has been no news of him. His case shows that the methods developed in Syria or Iraq can easily be transferred to any part of the world where law gives way to force and truth becomes too dangerous a commodity. For those behind these kidnappings, whether government troops, rebels, or terrorists, the goal is the same: to silence, to create an information vacuum in which any crime can be committed with impunity, knowing that no one will tell the world about it. The Asian continent, with its rapid economic growth and complex political landscapes, is another arena where journalists investigating corruption risk disappearing. Here, the threat comes not only from traditional criminal syndicates, but also from powerful state structures, special services, and influential political parties that do not tolerate criticism. In countries such as Pakistan, Bangladesh, and the Philippines, journalism often means walking on a knife's edge. In Pakistan, for example, journalists and bloggers who dare to criticize the influential army or intelligence services are regularly kidnapped. These disappearances are often temporary. People can be held for several days or weeks in an unknown location, subjected to interrogation and torture, and then dumped on the side of the road. The goal is not to kill, but to break, intimidate, and silence forever. The story of blogger and human rights activist Samar Abbas, who disappeared along with other activists, is an example of this tactic. Although he was eventually found, his case, like many others, shows how vulnerable critics of the authorities are. Official investigations into such abductions usually lead nowhere, creating an atmosphere of total impunity. The situation is similar in Bangladesh. Here, journalists investigating corruption within the ruling party or the activities of Islamist groups also risk their freedom. Journalist Utpal Das, who was working on stories about the political elite, disappeared in 2017. His disappearance caused a public outcry, and, fortunately, he was found alive 2 months later. But his story, like dozens of other lesser-known cases, serves as a chilling reminder. The pressure is not only physical. The authorities actively use repressive digital security laws to arrest journalists on trumped-up charges. As a result, many are forced to resort to self-censorship in order to survive. The Asian vector of disappearances is a silent, creeping war against freedom of speech, where the state often acts not as a protector, but as the main aggressor, using its entire apparatus to suppress dissent. Disappearance is a crude and brutal tool, but those who want to hide the truth have more sophisticated, quiet methods at their disposal that leave no blood on their hands but are no less effective at destroying journalistic investigations. One of the most effective is legal pressure, namely strategic lawsuits against public participation, or SLAPP suits. At first glance, this looks like a normal lawsuit. An influential corporation or official sues a journalist or their publication for defamation, demanding astronomical compensation for damage to their reputation. But the real goal of such a lawsuit is not to win in court or defend their good name. The goal is to wear down, intimidate, and bankrupt the defendant. Plaintiffs with virtually unlimited financial and legal resources drag journalists into years of litigation. Even if the journalist ultimately wins the case, they have already incurred enormous costs: lawyers' fees, lost time, and emotional burnout. This method has become a favorite weapon of oligarchs, corrupt politicians, and large companies around the world. They use the courts of London, New York, or other financial capitals to sue journalists from countries with less developed legal systems. This phenomenon has been dubbed libel tourism. The most striking example of how SLAPP suits are used for persecution is the story of Maltese journalist Daphne Caruana Galizia. Before she was killed in 2017, she had more than 40 defamation lawsuits filed against her. Her accounts were frozen, and her life became an endless series of court hearings. It was a deliberate campaign to silence her. SLAPP lawsuits create a powerful, chilling effect. Other journalists and editorial offices, seeing what is happening to their colleagues, will think twice before investigating the activities of any influential figure. This is a form of censorship through the courts, where the legal system is used as a weapon against those it was supposed to protect. As a result, high-profile corruption scandals never become public knowledge, not because there is no one to investigate them, but because the price of such an investigation becomes prohibitive. In the 21st century, the battlefield for truth has moved to the digital space. And here, journalists have a new, invisible, and omnipresent enemy: spyware. The most famous and scandalous example of such a weapon is the Israeli spyware Pegasus, developed by the NSO Group. Originally created to fight terrorists and major criminals, it fell into the hands of dozens of authoritarian and not-so-authoritarian governments around the world, who immediately turned it against their critics: human rights activists, opposition, politicians, and, of course, investigative journalists. Pegasus is the perfect spy. It can infect a phone without any action on the part of the owner through a so-called zero-click attack. Once installed, it gains full access to everything on the device: messages, emails, photos, location data. It can secretly turn on the camera and microphone, turning the phone into a pocket device for round-the-clock surveillance. For a journalist investigating corruption, this is a disaster. The main asset of any investigator is their sources, the people who risk their careers or freedom to pass on information. Confidentiality is the basis of their protection. Pegasus destroys that confidentiality. A government tracking a journalist can easily identify all of their informants, putting not only the investigation at risk, but also the lives of those people. In 2021, the investigative journalism consortium project Pegasus published shocking findings. A list of 50,000 phone numbers selected by NSO Group clients as potential targets for surveillance included the numbers of 180 journalists from 20 countries, including reporters from CNN, The New York Times, Le Monde, and many other leading global media outlets. Among the targets were the editor-in-chief of the Financial Times and the founder of OCCRP, Organized Crime and Corruption Reporting Project, one of the most effective networks of investigative journalists in the world. Digital surveillance is not just an invasion of privacy. It is a tool of repression that creates an atmosphere of total fear and paranoia. Journalists are becoming afraid to use their phones and are switching to old-fashioned methods of communication, but it is virtually impossible to completely protect yourself in the digital world. When the state can look into your pocket at any moment and listen to your most secret conversations, freedom of the press becomes a fiction. Who is behind the disappearances of journalists? Drug cartels, terrorist groups, mafia clans, undoubtedly. But in many cases, the trail leads much higher, into the corridors of power. There is ample evidence that state structures, the army, police, and special services, not only turn a blind eye to crimes against the press, but are themselves directly involved in committing them. In this case, enforced disappearance becomes an instrument of state policy, a way to get rid of unwanted critics without trial, investigation, or unnecessary noise. Bashar al-Assad's Syrian regime has turned this practice into a conveyor belt. Since the beginning of the civil war, thousands of Syrians, including dozens of journalists and media activists, have been kidnapped by security forces and disappeared into the state prison system. They are held in complete isolation, tortured, and many die due to inhumane conditions. At the same time, the authorities systematically deny the existence of these prisoners, refusing to provide any information to their families. This is not just lawlessness. It is a deliberate and cruel state machine designed to erase people. Another example is Eritrea, which human rights activists call one of the most closed countries in the world, a veritable black hole for information. Since 2001, at least 16 journalists have been held in prisons in this African country without trial or investigation. None of their relatives or colleagues have seen them since their arrest. The government of Isaias Afwerki refuses to say where they are being held, or whether they are even alive. This is a country where there is simply no independent press. It has been completely destroyed, and its representatives have been wiped out. Even in countries that are not dictatorships in the classical sense, the state can be involved in disappearances. In Russia, for example, the murders and abductions of journalists, especially those working in the North Caucasus and investigating corruption and human rights violations, often remain unsolved. Human rights defenders point to the possible complicity, or, at the very least, criminal inaction of local law enforcement agencies. When those who are supposed to protect the law become its main violators, journalists have no chance of justice. The state, which should be the guarantor of security, becomes the main predator. In this situation, investigating corruption becomes tantamount to suicide. Why do the murders and abductions of journalists continue year after year with such terrifying regularity? The answer lies in one word: impunity. In the vast majority of cases, those who order and carry out these crimes never face justice. This impunity is no accident. It is a system that encourages violence against the press. According to UNESCO, an organization that monitors the safety of journalists around the world, nearly 9 out of 10 cases of journalists being killed remain unsolved. Just think about that number. In 90% of cases, the killer and, more importantly, the person who ordered the killing remain free. This creates a vicious cycle of violence. When potential killers see that their predecessors got away with it, it becomes a green light for them. They understand that killing a journalist is an effective and, most importantly, safe way to solve a problem. Why does the justice system so often fail? There are several reasons. The first and foremost is the lack of political will. In many countries, journalists are killed while investigating corruption in the highest echelons of power. Naturally, those in power have no interest in an honest investigation that could expose them. Cases are slowed down, investigations are conducted perfunctorily, and key evidence is lost. The second reason is corruption and incompetence within the law enforcement agencies themselves. Police officers and prosecutors may be bribed by those whom the murdered journalist was supposed to expose. Or they may simply be afraid to investigate, fearing retaliation from powerful criminal groups or officials. The third reason is the weakness of the judicial system. Even if a case goes to court, it can fall apart due to pressure on judges, intimidation of witnesses, or poorly gathered evidence. As a result, the accused are released and the cycle of impunity continues. The international community sounds the alarm, UN resolutions are adopted, and human rights organizations publish reports. But on the ground, in the specific country where a specific journalist was killed, this changes little. Until governments show real determination to investigate every crime against media workers and hold those responsible to account, regardless of their position, journalists will remain targets. After all, impunity is not just a failure of the justice system. It is a silent license to kill. Behind every statistic on missing journalists is a human tragedy. These are not just numbers in reports by human rights organizations. They are lives cut short, families torn apart, and endless, agonizing uncertainty for those left behind. When a journalist disappears, hell on earth begins for their loved ones, spouses, children, parents, friends. Their lives come to a standstill, turning into an endless quest for the truth, in which hope battles despair. They knock on the doors of police stations, ministries, and prosecutors' offices, but more often than not, they are met with indifference, bureaucratic red tape, or outright lies. They are told that an investigation is underway, but months, years, and decades pass with no results. This uncertainty is a special form of torture. It prevents them from mourning their loss or moving on with their lives. The families of the missing often describe it as living in limbo, in a frozen moment in time, where every phone call or knock on the door could bring news of a miraculous rescue or terrible news. But they do not give up. They become human rights defenders by necessity. The mothers and wives of missing journalists hold pickets, organize press conferences, and create associations to make their voices heard. They travel around the world, speak at the UN and international forums, showing photos of their loved ones, telling their stories, and not letting the world forget about them. These people, without any special training, conduct their own investigations, gather information bit by bit, and find witnesses who are afraid to talk to the police. They do the work that the state is obliged to do, but does not want to do. And they are not alone in this struggle. The colleagues of the missing journalists, their editorial offices, as well as national and international journalists' unions, are supporting them. They continue to publish articles about the missing, demand answers from the authorities, and raise funds to help their families. This solidarity is a powerful force. It shows those behind the disappearances that they will not be able to simply erase a person. Behind every missing journalist is an entire community that will remember, search, and demand justice, no matter how long it takes. These stories are about incredible courage and resilience in the face of grief and systemic indifference. They are stories of love that is stronger than fear and oblivion. Sometimes the story of one journalist becomes a symbol of the tragedy of an entire country. In India, the world's largest democracy, where the press has traditionally played an important role, the work of a reporter, especially in the provinces, is fraught with enormous risk. The case of Chayan Sarkar, a journalist from West Bengal, is a tragic example of this. Although the details of his story, like many others, remain unclear, which is telling in itself. Journalists like him work far from the capitals and the attention of the mainstream media. Their focus is local corruption, embezzlement in road construction, illegal logging, and fraud involving government subsidies. These are crimes that may seem minor at first glance, but they directly affect the lives of ordinary people and are backed by influential local kingpins, politicians, businessmen, and criminal authorities. Chayan Sarkar reportedly disappeared in 2015. He worked for a small publication and, according to some sources, was preparing a series of articles on corruption in the education system, in particular on illegal fees in local colleges. It was a dangerous topic that touched on the interests of people accustomed to impunity. Shortly before his disappearance, he, like many of his colleagues in similar situations, may have received threats. This is a standard pattern. First, calls with advice not to meddle in other people's business, then more overt intimidation, demonstrations outside his home. When a journalist does not stop, he can simply be eliminated. What happened next is shrouded in chaos, conflicting information, and official silence. A man disappears, and the investigation, if it even begins, reaches a dead end. Witnesses remain silent, fearing for their lives. The local police, often linked to those the journalist was investigating, show little enthusiasm. The case of Chayan Sarkar is a microcosm of the problem. It shows that it is not famous capital city journalists who are most at risk, but local soldiers of the pen who stand alone against a rotten system. Their disappearances rarely make the world news, but they make up the bulk of the victims. Each such quiet disappearance is a victory for corruption and another step toward the destruction of democracy at the most basic local level. Against the backdrop of a growing number of attacks on journalists, a reasonable question arises. What is the international community doing? There are a number of international and non-governmental organizations whose mission is to protect freedom of speech and the safety of media workers. The UN, the Committee to Protect Journalists, CPJ, and Reporters Without Borders, RSF, are names that are constantly in the news. But how effective are their mechanisms? On paper, everything looks good. There is an international convention for the protection of all persons from enforced disappearance, adopted by the UN in 2006. The General Assembly and the Human Rights Council regularly adopt resolutions condemning violence against journalists. UNESCO implements the UN Plan of Action on the Safety of Journalists and the issue of impunity. Organizations such as CPJ and RSF do painstaking work. They track every case of assault, abduction, or murder, publish detailed reports and annual press freedom indices that put pressure on governments. They advocate at the highest levels, meet with heads of state, and demand investigations. In some cases, they help evacuate journalists who are under threat and provide legal and financial assistance to their families. This work is incredibly important. It keeps the victims in the public eye, draws attention to the problem, and creates a political cost for governments that persecute the press. However, we must acknowledge that these mechanisms have their limits. None of these organizations has any real leverage. They cannot arrest a murderer or force a sovereign state to conduct a fair investigation. Their main weapons are publicity and moral authority. But against authoritarian regimes that do not care about their international reputation, these weapons are often powerless. Governments can simply ignore UN resolutions, deny entry to international observers, and continue their repressive policies. The result is a paradox. International mechanisms work, but they do not work enough. They can put out the fire, but they cannot prevent arson. Until the protection of journalists becomes a real priority for the world's leading powers, which could use economic and diplomatic leverage, conventions and resolutions will remain nothing more than good intentions on paper. Every disappearance or murder of a journalist is not just an isolated crime. It is a carefully planned act of terror, aimed not only at eliminating one specific person, but also at sending a chilling message to the entire journalistic community. That message is, stay away. There are topics that people will kill for. And this message works, giving rise to one of the most destructive phenomena for freedom of speech: self-censorship. The psychological impact of such attacks is enormous. It creates what researchers call the chilling effect. Fear spreads like a virus. Journalists, seeing what happened to their colleague, begin to unconsciously or consciously avoid dangerous topics. An editor who yesterday was ready to publish a high-profile investigation decides today to hold it back until better times, fearing for the safety of his staff. A source ready to leak compromising information suddenly falls silent, realizing that their anonymity could be revealed and their life put at risk. Self-censorship is a sneaky enemy. It cannot be measured or proven. There are no official orders or bans. Newspapers continue to be published, TV channels continue to broadcast, but the most important and controversial topics gradually disappear from the information field. Corruption in the army, politicians' links to organized crime, environmental crimes committed by mega-corporations. Journalism becomes sterile, toothless, and safe. It ceases to fulfill its main public function, to be the watchdog of democracy. This fear paralyzes not only individual reporters, but entire newsrooms. It changes editorial policy, forcing journalists to abandon costly and risky investigations in favor of cheaper and more innocuous content. Ultimately, society as a whole loses out. When journalists remain silent, corrupt officials and criminals act even more brazenly and with impunity. The information vacuum is filled with propaganda, rumors, and misinformation. Citizens are deprived of their right to know the truth about how their country is run and how their taxes are spent. Thus, silence born of fear becomes the most effective weapon in the hands of those who want to hide their crimes. They achieve their goal without even resorting to new murders. The ghost of one murdered journalist can silence hundreds of living ones. When official investigations reach a dead end and justice is silent, the information vacuum is inevitably filled with alternative versions. This is how conspiracy theories are born. In the context of the disappearance of investigative journalists, they find particularly fertile ground. And although such theories should be treated with great caution, it is important to analyze why they arise and why they are so popular. Their emergence is a direct result of mistrust of the authorities and official versions. When the government claims that a journalist simply left home or was the victim of a domestic robbery, but all the evidence points to a carefully planned abduction linked to their professional activities, people start looking for other explanations. The most common theory is that behind all high-profile disappearances are not just individual corrupt officials or mafiosi, but a global, shadowy structure. This could be a world government, an all-powerful cartel of transnational corporations, or a secret society that rules the world from behind the scenes. According to this view, journalists who get too close to exposing their plans to control resources, finances, or politics are subject to immediate elimination. Another popular version shifts the blame to the secret services of the world's leading powers, which allegedly use journalists for their own games and then dispose of them like used material. These theories often exploit real facts, the existence of spyware such as Pegasus, secret CIA or KGB operations in the past, and extrapolate them to universal proportions. It is important to understand that analyzing these theories does not mean confirming them. Most often, they represent a simplified black-and-white picture of the world, where there is absolute evil and lone heroes. They ignore the complexity of real political and criminal processes. However, completely rejecting these theories would also be wrong. Like a distorted mirror, they reflect a real problem: total impunity and the merging of power, business, and crime at the highest levels. People feel that the system is rotten, and when they are not offered a convincing and honest explanation of what is happening, they create one themselves. Thus, conspiracy theories are not just fabrications, they are a symptom of a sick society that has lost faith in justice and the rule of law. After everything we have learned, after stories of kidnappings, torture, digital surveillance, legal suffocation, and total impunity, one main question arises: why? Why, despite the deadly risk, do investigative journalists continue their work? Why do they descend again and again into the darkest basements of human society, knowing they may not return? The answer is not money or fame. The answer lies in something much more fundamental. It is a heightened sense of justice. It is a deep belief that light can dispel darkness, and that the truth, even the most bitter, is better than sweet lies. It is an understanding that their work is not just a profession, but a service to society. They are the sanitation workers of the information space, exposing the festering sores of corruption so that society can heal. Each of them understands, if not them, then who? If everyone remains silent out of fear, the world will be plunged into a darkness of lawlessness, where the strong will always devour the weak, and those in power will be able to do whatever they want behind closed doors. Their courage is not the absence of fear. They are afraid, just like any normal person. But their sense of duty and their commitment to the ideals of their profession prove stronger. They continue to work for their colleagues who have already paid the ultimate price. They continue to work for the families who are waiting for the truth about their missing loved ones. And most importantly, they continue to work for us, ordinary citizens who have the right to know what is happening in their country and in the world. Their investigations are a light in the darkness. Every fact published, every scheme exposed, is a small step toward a more just and transparent world. Their steadfastness in the face of threats is an inspiring example of civic courage. And that is why it is our common task not to leave them alone in this struggle. We must demand that the authorities protect journalists, support independent media, disseminate their investigations, and, most importantly, remember the names of those who disappeared while trying to make our world a better place. For as long as there is even one journalist willing to risk everything for the truth, there is still hope.